Wade Harlan paid $712 for an airfield with a live federal contract still buried in its basement, and nobody in that room checked the paperwork before they started laughing. The date was March 3rd. The place was Hangar 4, Caldwell Ridge Regional Airfield, just outside Pueblo, Colorado. The auction had run 11 minutes past its scheduled close when Celeste Ashcraft-Oft, CEO of Ashcraft-Oft Aeronautics, offered the property as a joke to the man standing near the equipment table in a jacket that didn't match anyone else's suit. She wanted $712 written on a napkin turned into a real number on real paper, loud enough for 40 people to hear it and repeat it for months. Wade signed before she finished laughing. Nobody noticed the metal case. It sat under a floor panel in the old operations bunker, stainless steel, no markings except a serial number stamped in a font the FAA stopped using 19 years earlier. Wade found it on his second night on the property, using a flashlight with a cracked lens and batteries that were already dying. He didn't open it. He photographed the serial number, closed the panel, and said nothing to anyone. Not yet. 6 months later, the same woman who had sold him that airfield for $712 would be sitting in a parked car outside its gate, holding a written offer for $320 million, waiting for a security guard to confirm whether she even had permission to drive through. But none of that had happened yet. Right now, it was 9:47 p.m. The auction floor was empty, and Wade Harlan had exactly 6 hours before the county reassessment office opened and reclassified Caldwell Ridge as active federal land, a filing that would either make him rich or make him disappear from this story entirely. Wade Harlan lived alone in a rented single-story house 11 miles outside Pueblo, the kind of place with a carport instead of a garage and a water heater that needed to be hit twice before it worked. He'd been there 4 years. Before that, he'd been in Amarillo, and before that, Tulsa, following aviation maintenance contracts the way other men followed weather patterns, wherever the work was, wherever a regional carrier needed someone who could diagnose a hydraulic leak without pulling up a manual. He'd spent 19 years as an aircraft maintenance engineer, most of it on overnight shifts, most of it for companies that no longer existed. Sable Regional Air folded in 2011. Continental Crossroads Cargo folded in 2016. Each time, Wade collected his final paycheck, packed his tools into the same steel case he'd owned since he was 26, and found the next contract without complaint. He didn't talk about the layoffs. When people asked, he said the industry was seasonal, which was technically true, and left out everything that mattered. By the time he walked into that auction that morning in Denver, Wade was 44 years old, single, no children, and $6,200 behind on a truck loan he took out to cover a medical bill that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with a sister in Tulsa who no longer spoke to him but still needed the money. He never mentioned that either. He worked freelance now, mostly nights, mostly for a small charter operation that paid in cash and never asked questions about his background. The owner, a man named Kurt Ellison, liked Wade because he showed up on time and never overcharged for a diagnosis. Nobody else at that charter company knew Wade had once managed a full maintenance crew of 14 people, back when Sable Regional Air was still solvent, before the airline industry decided men like Wade were an expense rather than an asset. At the auction that morning, Wade wasn't there for Caldwell Ridge. He was there for a generator lot and a tow tractor listed at $3,400, equipment he intended to repair and resell to a salvage buyer in Trinidad, Colorado, for a modest profit that would cover the truck payment and put him 3 weeks ahead instead of 3 weeks behind. He had no plan to buy an airfield. He had no plan to be noticed at all.
That was until Celeste Ashcraft-Oft decided he'd make a good joke.
The metal case stayed on Wade's mind for 3 straight nights before he did anything about it. He'd photographed the serial number on his phone, NX4471CR, and sent it to Travis Callahan, a man he'd known since 2009, back when Travis worked the tower at Caldwell Ridge before the airfield went dark. Travis didn't answer the first night. He didn't answer the second. On the third night, at 11:14 p.m., Travis called back and asked Wade a single question before saying hello. "Where exactly did you find that number?" Wade told him. Travis went quiet for 11 seconds, long enough that Wade checked if the call had dropped. Travis explained that Caldwell Ridge hadn't always been a regional cargo stop. Before 2003, it had served as a relay node for a Federal Aviation Coordination Network, a system that routed emergency and defense-related air traffic across 3 states whenever primary channels went down. The program lost its funding in 2004. Nobody dismantled the hardware. They just walked away from it, the way government programs sometimes do when the money stops before the paperwork catches up. Wade asked why nobody had removed it in 19 years. Travis said removal required a federal contractor, a security clearance, and a line item in a budget that no longer existed for a program nobody remembered funding. Easier to leave it buried under a floor panel in an airfield everyone had already agreed was worthless. That was the first time Wade understood the case wasn't scrap. It was liability, or it was leverage, and the difference depended entirely on who found it first. The next morning, Wade drove back out to the operations bunker and pulled the county's original zoning file for Caldwell Ridge, a document he'd requested from the recorder's office 2 days earlier for $14. Buried in an appendix on page 19 was a single line most buyers would have skimmed past. The airfield's operating designation had never been formally terminated. It had been suspended in 2004, pending a review that apparently never happened. Suspended, not dead. Wade sat in his truck outside the county building with that page on his lap for almost 20 minutes, doing the kind of math that had nothing to do with money yet, and everything to do with what happens when an asset the world has forgotten still technically qualifies as active. He had one more call to make before any of it meant anything, to a lawyer who hadn't yet said yes to representing him. Mara Whittam's office sat above a hardware store on Union Avenue, 2 rooms and a receptionist's desk nobody had ever seen staffed. She'd been practicing land and contract law in Pueblo for 6 years, mostly handling water rights disputes and small business leases, nothing that had ever involved an abandoned federal relay system. Wade laid the zoning appendix on her desk on a Tuesday afternoon, along with the photograph of the serial number and a folder of notes he'd typed himself, single-spaced, no wasted words. Mara read the appendix twice before she said anything. She told him plainly that the suspended designation was either a clerical oversight the county never bothered to correct, or it was intentional, a status left open on purpose by someone who wanted the option to reactivate the site without going through a full federal relicensing process. Either way, she said, it didn't matter yet. What mattered was the contract Wade had signed in that auction hall, and whether it transferred the land alone or the land along with everything attached to it. She spent 40 minutes going through the contract line by line. Most of it was standard language, liability waivers, tax responsibility clauses, and as-is condition statement that protected Ashcroft Aeronautics from future claims about the property's physical state. But on page 11, in a section labeled Transferred Assets, the contract listed the parcel, the structures, and in language Mara read out loud twice to make sure she wasn't misreading it, all appurtenant infrastructure, permits, and technical records associated with the site, whether disclosed or undisclosed at time of sale. Mara looked up at Wade. She asked him if he understood what that meant. Wade said he thought he did, but he wanted her to say it anyway. She said it meant Celeste Ashcroft's own legal team had drafted a contract broad enough to hand him a functioning piece of federal-adjacent infrastructure without meaning to, because nobody on their side thought Caldwell Ridge was worth the time it would take to write a narrower clause. Wade asked what happened next if he tried to formally reactivate the airfield's status instead of just sitting on it. Mara told him the truth, which was that she didn't fully know yet. Nobody at her firm had ever filed a reactivation request for a suspended auxiliary airfield with an undisclosed federal relay system underneath it. She said she'd need 2 weeks to research it properly. Wade told her he didn't have 2 weeks. The county tax deadline was 19 days away, and the clock on everything else was already running underneath it.
Mara didn't need 2 weeks. She needed 4 days. And on the 4th day, she called Wade at 7 a.m. before he'd finished his coffee, telling him to come to the office immediately. She'd pulled the original 2003 federal transfer records through a public infrastructure database, the kind most attorneys never bothered checking because it required a specific request form most people didn't know existed. The relay system under Caldwell Ridge hadn't just lost funding in 2004, it had been quietly folded into a larger consolidation program that moved its coordination duties to a private contractor, a contractor that, according to a 2005 subcontracting filing, had been partially owned by a holding company under the Ashcraft-Oft family name at the time. Wade read the filing twice. Mara watched him read it. She explained what it meant plainly. Ashcraft-Oft Aeronautics, or a company connected to it, had benefited from Caldwell Ridge's relay traffic being rerouted to a private system 19 years earlier. The airfield hadn't failed because it stopped being useful. It had failed because someone with more leverage than the county had decided its usefulness belonged somewhere else, somewhere it could be billed privately instead of run as public infrastructure. That didn't prove Celeste herself had orchestrated anything. She'd have been in her 20s in 2004, likely nowhere near the operational decisions. But it meant the corporation she now ran had a documented history with this exact airfield, a history nobody at that Denver auction had mentioned when they sold it to Wade for $712. Travis, sitting in on the call by speakerphone from his kitchen in Trinidad, said something that stuck with Wade longer than anything Mara had found in the filings. He said Caldwell Ridge hadn't died of neglect. It had been switched off deliberately and then left standing long enough for everyone to assume the switching off was natural, the way a business assumes a competitor's factory closing was bad luck instead of a buyout. Wade asked Mara what any of this meant for the reactivation filing. Mara told him the suspended designation now looked less like an oversight and more like insurance, something left in place by whoever handled that 2004 transition in case the relay system ever needed to come back online without starting from a legal dead stop. She said the filing could work, but the moment they submitted it, whoever still tracked Caldwell Ridge's history would know within days, maybe hours. Wade told her to file it anyway. He'd already spent 6 days doing math that only made sense if he stopped being cautious and started being right. The reactivation filing went in on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Wade's phone was already ringing with calls he hadn't expected. A regional bank declining a loan application he'd submitted 3 weeks earlier, citing unresolved title complexity, and a contractor who'd quoted him $8,200 for runway lighting repair, calling back to say he could no longer take the job. Wade didn't chase explanations. He'd been laid off enough times in 19 years to recognize the particular silence that comes before someone decides you're not worth the risk. He kept working instead. He sold his 2009 pickup for $4,100 to a scrap buyer in Trinidad and used the cash to keep the county current on what he owed, a payment of $3,780 that cleared the account with 2 days to spare before the deadline Mara had circled in red. The proof came 19 days after the reactivation filing, not from a courtroom or a hearing, but from a phone call at 12:40 a.m. A medical transport company out of Colorado Springs had a shipment of donor tissue grounded by weather. Every larger regional airport within range either fogged in or already overloaded with diverted traffic. Their dispatcher found Caldwell Ridge listed in the county's newly updated aviation registry, active, not suspended, the filing having cleared 4 days earlier than Mara expected. She called Wade directly, asking if the runway lighting was apparational. It wasn't, not fully. Wade had rebuilt half the system himself using salvaged parts, and the other half ran on a generator he'd repaired the week before with $180 in parts from the same lot he'd once come to that Denver auction to buy in the first place. He told her yes anyway, then spent the next 40 minutes making it true, working the lighting panel by flashlight, with Travis patched in from his kitchen, walking a charter pilot through the airfield's exact coordinates over the radio. The aircraft landed at 1:52 a.m. By 2 a.m., ground crew had the shipment moving toward Colorado Springs in the ambulance, inside the window the surgical team needed. By 8 a.m., a local news producer in Pueblo had the story confirmed. An airfield most residents assumed had been closed for good had just handled an emergency landing every larger airport in the region had turned away. Wade stood on the tarmac afterwards, tools still in hand, watching the sun come up over a runway that 3 weeks earlier had been listed on a county spreadsheet as dead weight. His phone had already started ringing again. This time, nobody was calling to say no. The calls kept coming for a week before Wade understood what they actually meant. Freight coordinators, a regional cold storage broker, a small charter outfit out of Alamosa, all of them asking the same question in different words. Could Caldwell Ridge take on regular traffic, or had the medical landing been a one-time favor? Wade answered every call the same way. He said yes to what he could deliver and no to what he couldn't, and he wrote every commitment down in a notebook he kept in his truck because he'd learned from 2 failed airlines that overpromising was how good operations died young. Mara files for a phased operating certificate instead of a full commercial license, a distinction that let Wade legally handle limited cargo and charter traffic while the broader relicensing worked through the FAA's backlog. It meant slower growth. It also meant Wade could start charging landing fees and cold storage rent within weeks instead of years. That was when Bennett Kingsley's name first appeared, not through a phone call, but through a data request. Someone connected to Bennett Dominion Capital had pulled Caldwell Ridge's newly reactivated FAA registry listing and cross-referenced it against regional freight congestion data. Mara found the request logged in a public records portal and mentioned it to Wade almost as an afterthought. Wade didn't recognize the name yet. He filed it away the same way he filed away everything he didn't understand immediately. Not urgent, but not forgotten. What mattered more that week was the discovery underneath the operations bunker. Travis had gotten Wade access to a retired FAA technician willing to look at the relay hardware off the books, a favor owed from years earlier. The technician spent 4 hours going through the cabling and confirmed what Travis had suspected from the start. The system wasn't just old defense-adjacent hardware left to rot. It was still partially wired into a regional data backbone that 3 larger airports in the area were still quietly leasing bandwidth from, paying a private contractor for capacity that, according to the original 2003 documents, Caldwell Ridge itself was supposed to have provided for free as public infrastructure. Wade sat with that fact for a long time after the technician left. It meant the airfield he'd bought for $712 wasn't just a runway with a lucky location. It was sitting on top of a piece of regional data infrastructure that somebody somewhere was still being billed for privately, 19 years after Caldwell Ridge had supposedly gone dark.
He didn't know how much that was worth. He only knew that whoever had been collecting on it all this time would not be pleased when they found out he now understood what he owned. Bennett Kingsley called Wade directly on a Monday morning, no assistant, no scheduled appointment. He said he'd been watching Caldwell Ridge's freight numbers for 6 weeks and wanted to understand what Wade actually intended to build, not what he'd already built by accident. Wade told him the truth. He hadn't mapped out an ending. He'd been solving one problem at a time since the day he signed that contract, and the data relay discovery had only happened 3 weeks ago. Bennett said that answer told him more than a polished pitch would have, and he arranged for a technical team to survey the site. The survey confirmed what the retired technician had already found. 3 regional airports were leasing bandwidth from a private contractor for coordination capacity that Caldwell Ridge's relay system could provide directly at a fraction of the cost the moment it received proper civilian use certification. Bennett's engineers estimated the airfield's practical value, once fully certified and scaled, at 9 figures, a number that made the $712 sale price look less like a bad joke and more like a mistake someone would eventually have to answer for. That answer arrived faster than Wade expected. A letter came from Ashcraft Oft Aeronautics legal department arguing the underground relay system had never been properly transferred to civilian ownership and technically remained federal property, regardless of what the 2003 sale documents said. Mara read it once and told Wade it was a stalling tactic, not a real legal position. Ashcraft Oft's own signature had authorized an unrestricted transfer with no carve-outs, and someone in their legal department clearly knew that and was hoping Wade would fold before he checked.
He didn't fold. Mara filed a formal response within 72 hours, attaching the original contract language and the 2005 subcontracting filing, showing Ashcraft Oft's prior financial connection to the relay system's rerouting. 3 days after that filing landed, Celeste Ashcraft Oft called Wade herself for the first time since the auction. She didn't mention the letter. She offered him $2 million to walk away from Caldwell Ridge entirely. Wade sat with the phone against his ear for a long moment before answering. He told her no. She raised it to $10 million the following week, her voice noticeably less certain than it had been on the first call. Wade turned that down too. Not out of pride, but because he'd already run the numbers Bennett's engineers had given him, and he understood by then that no number Celeste offered would ever come close to matching what the airfield was actually worth once it was allowed to operate the way it had been built to operate in the first place. The county hearing that followed wasn't about money. It was staged as a safety review, called by board members who'd taken development promises from Ashcraft Oft in exchange for supporting a motion to suspend Caldwell Ridge's new operating certificate. Daphne Vale opened it with photographs of the airfield taken 7 months earlier, cracked runways and a collapsed terminal sign, presented as though nothing had changed since. Wade didn't raise his voice. He laid out inspection records, certified lighting system reports, and a letter from the medical transport company whose shipment had landed there in January. Mara followed by proving Daphne's photographs predated the reactivation by months, evidence she hadn't disclosed to the board honestly. Travis closed it out with the 2004 rerouting records, showing the board that Caldwell Ridge hadn't declined naturally. It had been shut out of freight traffic deliberately, years before Wade ever walked into that Denver auction hall. The room went quiet in a way Wade hadn't expected. One board member asked why nobody had brought these records forward before. Another admitted, under direct questioning, that Ashcraft Oft representatives had discussed development incentives with several members in the weeks leading up to the hearing. The motion to suspend failed 6-1. Celeste's position at Ashcraft Oft didn't survive the following quarter.
The board, already uneasy about the rerouting disclosures, forced her into an advisory role once the company discovered it needed access to Caldwell Ridge's relay network to salvage a federal contract of its own, the same infrastructure her legal team had spent weeks arguing didn't belong to Wade in the first place. She drove out to the airfield herself in March, almost exactly a year after the auction. A security guard asked if she had an appointment. She waited 11 minutes before Wade came out to meet her. There was no speech. Wade placed a contract on the table between them. A public acknowledgement of Caldwell Ridge's history, a share of Ashcraftoft's Western logistics network, and compensation for the years the surrounding county had gone without reliable medical transport capacity. Celeste signed it, not because she wanted to, but because there was no path forward for her company that didn't run through the airfield she'd once sold for $712 as a joke. Bennett Kingsley became a formal partner soon after, though Wade kept full operational control. Travis took over flight operations. Mara stayed on as lead counsel. Wade still walks the runway most evenings, alone, watching aircraft take off over land nobody thought was worth $1,000 a year ago. When people ask what he's building next, he tells them the truth. He was never building an empire. He was just paying attention to something everyone else had already decided to forget.